All right, everybody, welcome. Today is Honors 100 Comparative Classics, our third class on St. Augustine's Confessions. We're working our way through this. We'll make it most of the way. I probably won't have to skip anything, although I might speed up from this class, next class. We'll see, though. My speed up does not always seem to go that fast. That's just a part of my character, I think. I actually enjoy this stuff. Like, the books we read. I pick books that are great books, but I pick books that I, also, like, why would I pick ones that I didn't like to read? That'd be weird. That happens sometimes. I'll pick books that are eminent, but not my favorite. There's a couple I do. And I won't tell you which ones they are. But students aren't dumb. They could probably tell. All right, let's see. Just looking at my book. Alright, so last time we finished book 2, we are now on book 3. And let us get into it. Uh-oh. No, don't open Microsoft Word. Oh, my God. Okay. Here we go. You can see all the stats studies I was grading this week. Oh, alright. So let's go. Okay. So book 3 of Confessions. When we left off, we talked about a lot of his, youth, we'll call it teenage years. Hopefully it's sympathetic to all of you. Book 3, what happens? Well, first things first, he goes to Carthage. And, to quote himself, he found himself in the midst of a hissing cauldron of lust. Yay. Very descriptive man. So, he generally speaking, he says, I had not yet fallen in love, but I was in love with the idea of it, and this feeling that something was missing that made me despise myself for not being more anxious to satisfy the need. And he said, I began to look around for some object of my love, since I badly wanted to love something that I had no liking of. And then he goes into his theology a little bit, right? He says, obviously, right, he's a Christian saint, so he has to talk about that. He says, though my real need was for you, O God, who are my food of the soul, I was not aware of this hunger. So then he's like, I'm hungry for something, but I don't know what it is. I felt no need for the food that does not perish, because I had had my fill of it. Oh, not because I had my fill of it, but because I was more starved the more I was starved, the less palatable it seemed. And he mentions he literally broke out in ulcers. Or at least, he said he broke out in ulcers, but he says, I'm looking for worldly means for relieving the itch which they caused. And this is interesting. Christians aren't anti-materialists, almost like Stoics are. And Stoics aren't really anti-materialists, they just think matter is secondary to the soul. He mentions this, it's his theory on material. But material things, which have no soul, could not be true objects of my love. Interesting, right? He's implying that you can't truly love any objects, right? You have to love something that has a soul. Maybe think about it, it makes sense. Can you love a car as much as a person, really? It's a good question. And he says, to love and to have my love returned was my heart's desire, and it would be all the sweeter if I could enjoy the body of one who loved me. So he's being very specific with this this desire he's looking for. And then we get another a bunch of his famous turns of phrase. And one reason this book's still read is his phrases are very descriptive. So he says, quote, I muddied the stream of friendship with the filth of lewdness and clouded its clear waters with hell's black river of lust. That's who he is. All right. He says, I was vain enough to have an ambition of cutting a fine figure in the world. And he mentions he did, in fact, fall in love. And part of the consequence of his love at the end, he talks about my joy. I was caught in the coils of trouble. I was lashed with cruel, fiery rods of jealousy, suspicion, anger, and quarrels. So, didn't make him that happy. Then he gets into what he did with his time. He mentions he liked the theatre, and we're spelling it British because that's how he spells it. And by British, we mean basically this is the Latin spelling, right? British English tends to cleave much more to the Romance or in the Latin than to the. I didn't go that far. It tends to cleave much more to the Latin spellings of things than to the Germanic, right? So it's center with an R-E and theater with an R-E. And why did he like the theater? It's interesting. He says, because the plays reflected my own unhappy plight and were tinder for my fire. So we all know what a theater is, right? But in his day, right, the theater is what you would think of like Netflix as, right? It's the entertainment that everybody does. And it's common and it's everywhere and it's cheap. And he gets more into the theory of it. And again, remember, this is philosophy too. He asks questions. He says, why is it that men enjoy the feeling sad at the sight of tragedy and suffering on the stage, although they would be most unhappy if they had to endure the same fate themselves? And remember, we've answered these questions with Plato asked a lot of these same questions, right? And again, we talked about St. Augustine as a Platonic thinker in a lot of his influences. So this is one of those cases. And he makes a guess here. Let me see. Yet they watch plays they hope to be made to feel sad, and the feeling of sorrow is what they enjoy. And this with an exclamation point, he says, "What miserable delirium is this?" The more a man is subject to such suffering himself, the more easily he is moved by it in the theater. And then interesting, he says this: when he suffers himself, we call it misery. When he suffers out of sympathy for others, we call it pity. And then he asks the Platonic question here: what sort of pity can we feel in an imaginary scene on the stage? And that's a good question. And he mentions, if they leave a theater in a disgruntled mood, like say it's done badly, people are sad. But if they actually feel the pain and the sorrow, they leave happy. And again, if you think about that, that's true even for us, right? Films or TV shows, right? Like if it makes you feel something, it's considered good. And if it's done badly and you don't feel anything, it's considered not good, right? It wasn't well executed. He says on the next paragraph, this shows sorrow and tears can be enjoyable. And then on happiness, he makes this comment. Of course, everyone wants to be happy, but even if no one likes being sad, there's just one exception that, because we enjoy pitying others, we welcome their misfortunes, without which we could not pity them. So, we want to be happy, but, we kind of derive happiness out of pity, which is an interesting critique of the theater itself. And he says probably the better pity, he says, although a man who is sorry for the sufferings of others deserves praise for his charity, nonetheless, if his pity is genuine, he would prefer there should be no cause for his sorrow. So the kind of a virtuous pity for him is where there's a solution. And obviously he's a Christian, right? So he wants it to be a godly solution where it was that. But yeah, he's still generally a pity skeptic, is what I'd call him. Alright, so again, he gets into the psychology of the theater here, if you're curious. And it's still the modern debate, if you think about it genuinely, right? What effect does media have on our minds? We argued that with Plato a little bit. We didn't go as heavily in this class as I do in another one. We focus more on his pure philosophy. But it's an interesting theory, right? How does media, and media just means transmission, right? Medium is the way things arrive at you. So, how does medium affect us? Then he gets into again, his kind of theology again. So again, like we talked about this book, it transitions between two things. He mentions even while all this stuff's happening, isn't just enjoying the pure pleasure of the world. He says, "Far above your mercy hovered faithfully about me. I exhausted myself in depravity in the pursuit of unholy curiosity." He talks about all the bad things he did. And he says, "I deserve to pluck the fruit of death, and you punished me for it with a heavy lash. But compared with my guilt, the penalty was nothing. How infinite is your mercy, O God." So he makes a point that God gives him a break. And then he immediately, he's like, "I didn't just party and have, like, lustful times all the time." He also talks about, "I also studied the law." This is the 58. "Such an ambition was held to be honorable, and I was determined to succeed in it." And he makes an interesting observation about the law here, which I wonder if it's not completely disconnected from nowadays. "The more unscrupulous I was, the greater my reputation was likely to be, for men are so blind that they take pride in their blindness." And he mentions, "By now I was top in my school of rhetoric, I was pleased by my superior status, and swollen with conceit." And he mentioned this group of people they had at their law/rhetoric school. They were called the Wreckers. In other words, they had ferocious devilry which the fashionable set choose for themselves. And he felt shame because he wasn't like them, basically. Here we go. "Without provocation, they would set upon a timid newcomer, gratuitously affronting his sense of decency with their own amusement, and using it as fodder for their spiteful jests." A heavy implication of, like, hazing, basically. All right. Let's see. 4, 5. Which one's 4? Oh, 4 just talks about his ambition as a good speaker. I didn't put it on here. But he says, "There was companions whom I studied the art of eloquence at an impressionable age. It was my ambition to be a good speaker, for the unhallowed and inane purpose of gratifying human vanity." So he kind of apologizes for it, but at the same time he says, "Prescribed course of study brought me in the work of an author named Cicero, whose writing nearly everyone admires." And it basically gave me aspirations. It says, "All my empty dreams suddenly lost their charm, and my heart began to throb with a bewildering passion for the wisdom of eternal truth." So reading Cicero, he actually started to get interested in philosophy. And he says, "It wasn't the style but the contents that won me over, yet the allowance which my mother paid me was supposed to spend on putting my edge to my tongue. I was now in my 19th year, and she supported me because my father had died." And then we get some more of his questions. He talks about what is wisdom. This is on 59 if you have your book. So we already know some of this. He mentions the Greek word philosophy means love of wisdom. With this love that Cicero inflamed him. There were people from whom philosophy is means of misleading others, sophists, right, for the people who killed Socrates. For they misuse the great name, its attractions, its integrity, to give color and gloss to their own errors. Most of those so-called philosophers who lived in Cicero's time and before are also noted in the book. He shows them up to their true colors and makes quite clear how wholesome it is ambition, had admonition. Then he just quotes a Christian admonition versus philosophy. But now suddenly he has an interest in it. And then, interestingly enough, we get his first encounter with, this is 5 on 60. We get his first encounter with Scripture, right? He reads the Bible, basically. And he says this, "So I made up my mind to examine the Holy Scriptures." Because he's looking for wisdom now. And he read Cicero. He's like, okay, I got to look for philosophy. My mom has been talking about this for a whole long while. I'm going to go read what Mom's thought. And he says this, "So I made up my mind to examine the Holy Scriptures and see what kind of books they were. I discovered something that was once beyond the understanding of the proud and hidden from the eyes of children. Its gate was humble, but the heights it reached were sublime. It was enfolded in mysteries, and I was not the kind of man to enter into it or bow my head to follow where it led." He said, "But these were not the feelings I had when I first read the Scriptures. To me, they seem quite unworthy of comparison to the stately prose of Cicero, because I had too much conceit to accept their simplicity and not enough to insight to penetrate the depths. So when he first got into reading the scriptures, the holy book of Christianity, if you don't know, right? He tried to read it, it didn't work. Now his reason he thinks it doesn't work, he said, I was too proud to call myself a child, I was inflated with self-esteem, which made me think myself a great man. So he rejected it. He tried to read the Bible as a kid, 19, so he's y'all's age. He tried to read it, didn't take. So then he's looking for philosophy now. What does he find? To quote the book, I fell in with a set of sensualists, men with glib tongues, who ranted and raved and had the snares of the devil in their mouths. Wow. And they're basically Christian heretics. Where is my... So this is obviously after he fell into it. So he spent 10 years with these guys. And he mentions a final one, the Paraclete. This is their founder, basically. And they talked about God left. They talked about truth and truth alone. And again, he was looking for truth, so it sounds good, right? He says this though afterwards, obviously, right? All that they said was false. Both what they said about you, who's talking to God, right? And who is truly the truth, and what they said about this world and its first principles, which were your creation. So he didn't really know philosophy yet, and he kind of got his first glimpse into religion/philosophy with these guys. These are the Manichaeans. We talked about them in the introduction a little bit. But I ought not to have been content with what philosophers said about such things, even when they spoke the truth. And he gets into kind of what's the nature of truth here. He says, the paragraph 2, he says, truth, how the very marrow of my soul within me yearned for it as they dinned in my ears over and over again. So he was hungry, looking for something, for sure. And he mentions what he found wasn't very satisfying. He says, while my hunger was for you, for truth itself, these were the dishes on which they served me up, the sun and the moon, beautiful works of yours, but still only works, not you yourself, even the greatest of your created things. And he mentions this too, this is very Platonic. It's Christian, but Platonist as well. For your spiritual works are greater than your material things, however brightly they may shine in the sky. So Manichaeans still focused on kind of the here and now. Is there anything else I want to mention with 6? Let me see my notes. Take a sec. He goes into his dream and his foolishness. That's fine. Let's see. Yeah, on these 2 pages he goes a lot into the creation of celestial bodies. This is on page 61. And he mentions how the things he was studying wasn't that satisfying. They were dreamlike substances, mock realities, far less true than the real things, which we see in the sight of our eyes, in the sky, or on the earth. So it wasn't even empirically true. And then he gets into creation, like, the idea that God made all the stuff, and how far God is from these fantasies he learned from the Manichaeans. Basically. And then he asks another question, where were you in those days? He asks this question a lot, by the way, in the early part of the book. How far were you from me? I was wandering far from you, and I was not allowed to eat the husks which I fed to the swine. And he said, remember he just made fun of the poets, last class, chapter 2? He now says, for surely the fables of the poets and the penmen are better than the traps of these impostors. So he actually went from, kind of true, not great, to worse. And he gets a little bit into it, but we're not going to get that much into it. I'm not that worried about it. And he mentions how he struggled from the lack of truth, basically. So, not totally satisfying. And then he gets into more the connection to this and kind of his philosophy again, and this is almost metaphysics. On 7, he says, there is another reality besides this, though I know nothing of it. My own specious reasoning induced me to give it the sly arguments of fools who asked me what is the origin of either evil, whether God was confined to the limits of bodily shape, whether he had hair and nails, whether men could be called just if they had more than one wife at the same time, or killed other men, or sacrificing living animals. So from this we get a little bit of Manichaeanism. They thought about they thought nature was kind of equal with good, or evil was equal with good. They thought God was confined to physical reality. They asked, does he have hair and nails? And killing other men and sacrificing the animals. They were like the Manichaean elect were like hardcore vegans. I mean, it even meant later it mentions like it was religion, right? So it wasn't just that like they couldn't harvest food. They're called the elect. The elect couldn't harvest food, but when they ate food other people harvested, it became like consecrated. Like the food became holy because they ate it. Don't get me wrong, it's a really self-serving religion. Like, oh, I cannot eat, but you, my follower, if you give me food, I will break it down and make it good and poop it out. You're like, wow, thank you, master, for pooping out the food. It's pretty funny. The funny part, he's like, my ignorance was so great these questions troubled me, and while I was approaching the truth, I was only departing the further from it. And he said, talking about the good and evil, he says, I did not know that evil is nothing, but the removal of good until no good remains. We'll get more into that later. Let's see. Is there anything else I want here for 7? And then he gets in kind of like eternal law. He has a lot of asides. If you've been keeping up with this and noticed, let's see. He's had a lot of like side tangents, I would say. This is 63. So he'll be in narrative, right? So like he's explaining the sect he was in, and then he'll make an association with something philosophical. And then he'll riff on that, and we'll get to it. Somebody asked a question, which I'll interrupt this for. Is the other reality he's talking about just like the higher form from Plato? It's like Plato's intelligible reality, except the intelligence is made by God, and it actually cares about you. So if you don't know anything about like kind of, we'll say, Christian metaphysics or spirituality, they basically get it's like the Greek metaphysics, except God actually cares that humans exist, right? For Plato, it's shining there regardless if we address it or not. And we can access it in a Platonic sense. We just have to choose to do it. It isn't concerned with us. And we have to have the ability of being born with it. For St. Augustine, God actually is personally invested in kind of sharing his truth with us. So it's a more personal connection compared to Platonic thought. And generally speaking, the Christian view, it's accessible to everyone. Somewhat like the Stoics, actually. Okay, so he gets here, he talks about virtue again. He talks about justice on 63. I knew nothing of the true underlying justice which judges not according to convention, but according to the truly equitable law of the Almighty God. So this is, in a Christian phrase, very much like the Platonic idea, right? So there's justice is free of just convention, right? There's justice free of all of our feelings about it. He says, this law by which each age and place forms rules of conduct best suited to itself, although the law itself is always and everywhere the same and does not differ from place to place or age to age. And then he gives a bunch of examples. So, just like Plato and Aristotle, he agrees there's this like personified justice in reality, which we then access to make just societies. So again, it is the form of Plato, except it has like there's a judge too, right? It's not just justice floating by itself, and there is a God in Plato, but it's more like specifically, God is also the guy who made the law and guarantees the law, and he cares about people following the law. It's more invested, basically. That was a really good timed question. Wow. Let's see. And 7 goes way more into that. And he spends 2 pages, actually, 63, 64, on judgment and the nature of what justice is. And he mentions, this is interesting, at the end of his section on justice, but when only one individual, one day, or one house is concerned, he can easily see what is suitable for each part of his whole and for each member of the household, and what must be done in times and places. These things he accepts, but other habits of other ages he finds fault. He points out it's really hard to see this work in all ages for most people, but on like the more specific scale, humans have that kind of instinct or conscious, like a consciousness, or as Conmentius would say, a heart, to understand justice. And then immediately he gets back on tangent. I knew nothing of this at the time. So he gets back to his story. He said, I did not discern that justice, whose good and holy men obeyed, is far more perfect and sublime than poetry contains in itself, and all the principles which it prescribes. So, he's like, I didn't see it yet. Alright, the next part, let's see, what point did I want to make with this? This one actually, he continues on his previous rift. This is, I think 8 is all about justice. Hold on. Yeah, all of 8 is basically about justice. He asks a question, again, it's one of his, you can tell it's philosophy when he starts asking questions, basically. And here he says, surely it is never wrong for any time or place for a man to love God with his whole heart, his whole soul, his whole mind, and to love his neighbor. It's a great commandment. He says, sin against nature, therefore, is like the sin of Sodom, who is abominable and deserve punishment whenever they are committed. So he talked about justice, now he talks about punishment, basically. And so God's law is basically objective, and the punishment is also objective. And this is interesting, and why it's interesting even if you don't care about the theological or the metaphysical point. He talks about human codes. Offensive against human codes of conduct vary according to differences of custom, so that no one, whether he is a native or a foreigner, may suit his own pleasure, violate the conventions established by the customary usage of law in the community of the state. For any part that is out of keeping with the whole is at fault. His only exception is here, and this is one of Augustine's more interesting innovations. He says, but if God commands a nation to do something contrary to its customs or constitution, it must be done, even if it has been never done by that custom before. So generally you have to follow the law, unless it goes against God's law. And he mentions, for all must yield to God, just as the government of human society, the lesser authority must yield to the greater. So it's a very involved legal justification here, actually. And he gets into main categories of sin and desire for power. Let me see if there's anything in here I want to cover. And this is interesting. He gets into the punishment. He says, God, he's talking to God again. He says, he asks the question, how can sins of violence against you, since nothing can injure you? Answer, your punishments are for the sins which men commit against themselves, because although they sin against you, they do wrong to their own souls, and malice is self-betrayed. They corrupt and pervert their own nature, which you made, and which you shape the rules, either by making wrong use of things for which you allow, or becoming inflamed with passions to make unnatural use of things which you do not allow. So it's interesting that in his just theory, it's basically the reason there's punishment is because you're hurting yourself. That's the idea. Somebody asked another great question. Let me see. So does this idea contradict with Plato's philosophy and individual living for the betterment of the community? No, I think he's still agreeing with that. Justice is in the interest of the community. But if the community has a law that goes against God's law, the community should switch to follow God's law. That's what he's saying. And if you're the only one who thinks you should, like if you're the only godly man or woman or something, he would say, in that case, follow God's law. But the broad implication is that the community should follow it. That's what he's saying. And in that way, it doesn't really contradict Plato, right? If Plato said the virtues are forms which are above man, we should follow the forms and not man's, elaboration on the forms, if that makes sense. It's a good question. All right, do I have more here? We did that. Do I care about this one? Let's see, 9. And interesting too, you're welcome. He even mentions good men, which he mentions vices and crimes are all endless wages men do wrong. Their sins of those who follow the right path will go astray. So even people who are, in the Christian conception are on the team, right? He says, by the rule of protection, those lapses are condemned if we judge them aright, but sinners may yet be praised, for they give promise of better fruit to come, like young shoots which later bear the corns of fruit. And again, this is one of the good themes to point out about this book. He's not saying he is a great, perfect man, right? Because he can sound harsh. Augustine quoted out of context. Sounds super harsh. But in fact, right, he did all the things that he's condemning, right? He's like, I've done all those things, and like, I definitely should be, burning, but I'm not, which is a pretty interesting thing. Let's see. And he reinforces the point made earlier at the end of 9. He just says, but when you suddenly command us to do something strange and unforeseen, even if you had previously forbidden it, none can doubt that the command must be obeyed, even though for the time being you may conceal a reason for it, and conflict with the established rule of custom in forms of society. For no society is right or good unless it obeys you. There we go. So he gives the right, like, he is Platonic up to the point, right? But then there's that limit where he's like, okay, then in some point you resist society if it goes against the commandment of God. So again, this is what St. Augustine's other books literally called City of God. So he kind of makes like a 2-sphere Platonic community. In his theory, there's basically the community that has like men who are non-Christians, and there's the community of God, which is people following God's law. Although he does point out they don't all necessarily call themselves Christians. But there's like these two so for St. Augustine, he gets Platonic theory, but it splits into two, where there's like like how reality has material reality and then intelligible reality. St. Augustine thinks communities are the same way, right? There's like the material community and the intelligible God-focused community. So he kind of breaks it up. And this is the beginning of it. His other book is way longer. If you want to know more about that, I actually have a lecture on Twitch this week, actually, for my 190 class where we talk about it, if you're curious. All right, and as always, just keep asking me questions. I'm going to keep going, though. We're still on book 3. And I got to flip my notes over. There we go. Oh, not that way. And now we get a little bit more about the Manichaeans. Let's be honest, it's veganism. This is interesting, though. From 10... he mentions all the stuff he just mentioned. He was ignorant of all this at the time. And but I achieved was by deriding them was to earn your derision for myself. For I was gradually led to believe such nonsense as, this is what the Manichaeans believe, the fig wept when it was plucked, and that the tree which bore it shed tears of mother's milk. So basically, harvesting food literally makes the tree cry. But if some sanctified member of the sect were to eat the fig, someone else, of course, would have committed the sin of plucking it. He would digest it and breathe it out again, as a form of angels, or even the particles of God, retching them up as he groaned in prayer. And then these particles of this true and supreme God were supposedly imprisoned in the fruit, and could only be released by the means of a stomach and teeth of the elect. And then, this is funny, the conclusion, 10 is pretty short. He says, I was foolish enough to believe we should show more kindness to the fruits of the earth than to mankind, for whose use they were intended. And this is where it's depressing, right? They say here, if a starving man, not a Manichae, were to beg for a mouthful of food, they would thought a crime worthy of mortal punishment to give him one. Like, the Manichaeans wouldn't feed the poor, because, like, no, we must eat the food to make it better. Like, it's like, wow, that's something. Caring more about fruit than the, other humans. So again, this is where he's showing his kind of waking up, but not yet. Then we get a little bit more about his mother. This is actually a pretty short slide. She actually has a dream, and the ancients, we saw it with Marcus Aurelius. The ancients much more valued dreams, and again, remember, Marcus Aurelius and Saint Augustine are both Romans, so they have a Roman view of it. And here's I'm going to quote the dream from subsection 11. It says, "She dreamed as she was standing on a wooden rule. Coming towards her in a halo of splendor, she saw a young man who smiled at her with joy, although she herself was sad and quite consumed with grief. He asked her the reason for her sorrow and her daily tears, not because he didn't know, but because he had something to tell her, for this is what happens in visions. When she replied that her tears were for the soul I had lost, he told her to take heart. If she looked carefully, she would see that where she was, there also was I," St. Augustine. "And when she looked, she saw me standing beside her on the same rule." And then she told him this dream. And kind of the culmination of the dream is this. It was, no, he did not say, "Where he is, you are," which implies she should become a heretic. But instead, "Where you are, he is." So he said this memory stuck with him. He didn't do anything at the time. "I was deeply moved by this than the dream itself, in which the joy for this devout woman was still so long to wait, was foretold so long before, the comfort of her time of her distress." So she had to wait 9 years, basically. And as part of this, she actually went to her... This is how devout his mom was. I mean, remember, his mom became a saint, too. Her saint day is actually the day before his. So it's actually given eminence above his own, even though she never wrote anything. Right? What did St. Monica do? Why is she famous? She literally just spent her whole life praying for her son, who became one of the great saints of the church. So she's a famous... So, never say that there aren't famous women in the tradition. So it says... where's this? His mother went to a bishop who was a devout man. She asked him for a favor to come talk to St. Augustine so that he might refute his errors. And this is a thing this guy did. It was like he would go help kids of people in the church. And this is funny. He refused. He said, "A wise decision," I afterward realized. What he told her is I was still unripe for instruction because she had told him. I was brimming with the novelty of heresy and had already upset a great many people just for my speech. And he said, quote, "Leave him alone, just pray for him. From his own reading he will discover his mistakes and the depth of his profanity." And then she kept bugging him. This mom is persistent. And then eventually he says this on the last page of the chapter, "Leave me and go in peace. It cannot be that a son of these tears should be lost." And it says his mom just accepted that as a message from God, basically. But this just shows you why his mom became a saint. His mom was like on fire, man. She did not let him rest. And the context for all of this was she originally wouldn't even eat with him. Right? She was refusing to eat with her son, and then she had these visions and talked to this priest, and she's like, "Okay, I'll put in the work, I'll eat with the heretic," But his mom's hardcore. So she's just crying and praying all the time, and I think 9 more years, he says. So mom's hardcore. There we go. All right, how are we doing time? 25 minutes. Perfect. Let's keep going. Now we did a lot of philosophy in 3. Now we're switching to 4, which it goes back to being more autobiographical again. And remember, this book has a lot of these favors. It's a confession. It's an autobiography. It's a philosophy. And it's like education for new Christians. It's all of these things together. It's one reason I picked it. You get a lot out of not that much. So if you'd never studied anything in the tradition, it's like, a lot of this is put together by St. Augustine. Like, he didn't invent it all. He invented some of it, but not all of it. And by invent, I mean like synthesize, right? But he is famous for putting it all together. So now we've got, let me get to my book 4. He talks about his history again. We're back to book 4 at number 1. He says, during the space of these 9 years, and how old was he? He was 19 to 28. He said, he was led astray and led others astray. We were deceived and deceived, both publicly when we expounded our so-called liberal ideas, and in private through our service to what we called a religion. And he says, in public, We were cocksure, in private superstitious, and everywhere void and empty. And superstition, there's an interesting definition of this word from Varro, who is an ancient Roman pagan. He says superstition is fear of the divine, whereas religion is like respect. So when he says superstition, he's implying like fear. And cocksure, if you don't know what that means, that's where we get cocky from, right? It used to just be cocksure. Like you act like a rooster, basically. That's what it means. It's literally what it means. Oh, it doesn't mean any dirty thing you think it means. That is a much later elaboration. All right. And then we get into his career. Number 2. In those years, he finally becomes a teacher of public speaking. So by 19, by the way. So 1920, he's like a full-time teacher of public speaking. And he's that good at it. And he says, love of money had gained the better for me, and for I sold it to others, the means of coming off better in the debate. But it's interesting to point out, he says, he's confessing, right? But he says, you know, Lord, I preferred honest pupils, so far as honesty had any meaning nowadays. And I had no evil intent when I taught the tricks of pleading, for I never meant them to be used on innocent condemned, but as the occasion arose to save the lives of the guilty. So even when he was kind of heretic / non-Christian, right? He emphasizes. Now I'm choking. He emphasizes his focus on honesty, right? So he was looking for truth, right? He wasn't a Platonist yet either. This is interesting. We get to it. I think it's book 5 and 6, maybe even later. He hasn't even had his Platonist conversion yet. So but he had those instincts where he's like, I think I want to be, treat somebody honest. You could argue probably his mom had something to do with this too, right? And then he gets into his life as well. In those days I lived with a woman who was not my lawful wedded wife, but a mistress, whom I had chosen for no special reason but my restless passions, and alighted on her. But he says, but she was the only one, and I was faithful to her. Hey, there's something. And he said, living with her I found out my own experience, the difference between restraint of the marriage alliance, contracted for the purpose of having children, and the bargain struck for lust, which the birth of children is begrudged, though if they come, we cannot help but love them. This is also where you get like the Catholic, traditional Christian view of what marriage is, right? It is a marriage alliance contracted for the purpose of children. Again, one of the oldest ideas in the church. So you don't have to like it, but it's there. And then after this, I almost skipped it. He mentions he was so good at rhetoric, he'd win paid competitions. And one time, he decided to enter a competition for dramatic verse. A sorcerer sent to ask me how much I would pay to make certain he won. And he mentions, like, I loathed and detested these foul rites, and told him that even if a prize of a crown of gold that would last forever, I would not even let a fly be killed to win it. So, like, a sorcerer threatened him. It's a threat, right? Like, hey, but like, if you don't give it to me, you're going to lose. And St. Augustine, before he was a saint, he's just like, hey, like, I wouldn't even pay you to hurt a fly for my victory. It wouldn't be worth it. But at the same time, interestingly enough, he loved astrology. This is section 3. And he mentions the same reasoning why he didn't like sorcery. It did not prevent him consulting those impostors, the astrologers, because I argued they offered sacrifices and no prayers. And he mentions true Christian piety rejects and condemns what they do. But again, he wasn't a Christian yet, right? And he really got into it. And also, the interesting part about this, too, astrologers in the ancient world believed that sin was determined by the heavens. What does this mean? They're determinists. They're ancient world determinists. If you don't know what determinists mean, it's the opposite of free will, right? It means you don't choose what you do, like the universe decides what happens to you. So determinists aren't new. I know modern determinists like to think they invented it. It's been around for forever. So basically, man is guiltless. Yeah, from an astrological point of view, right? You didn't do it, the stars made me do it. Right? It's just my lucky stars. I can't control it. And for a while, St. Augustine was getting sucked into this. And then he meets a doctor while doing the doctor was just hosting a competition he won. He was a proconsul at the time, which means he had a high position in the government. When he gave him the wreath, they became friends. He and I became better acquainted, and I listened intently without fail to what he had to say. And he was not a gifted speaker. He was lively mind, gave weight and charm to his words. In the course of his conversation, he learned that Augustine was an enthusiast for astrology, and he was fatherly. He advised him to throw away that waste no further pains upon such rubbish, because there were more other valuable things to be done. And he said when he was a kid, before he wanted to become a doctor, he wanted to become an astrologer, and then he studied it. He said, here we go. He took up medicine instead for the very good reason that he had found that they were entirely wrong, astrology. And being an honest man, he had no wish to earn his living by deception. And then St. Augustine asked, why is it that the future is often correctly foretold by astrology? And he gave me, the doctor, the only possible answer, that it was due to the power of chance, a force that must always be reckoned with in the natural order. And he mentions, like, sometimes people open books of poetry at random to get, like, advice. That doesn't, it's still just random, right? It's not skill. And he basically thanks God, like, hey, thank you. And then we get a story, this is where it gets a little sad, of his dear friend, number 4. This is when he started teaching in his hometown, Thagrasta. Yeah, I'm going to call it Thagrasta. I'm sure it's wrong. That's why I'm saying it with like a southern accent. I'm tripling down. Thagrasta? Okay, so when he started teaching at Thagrasta, he found a very dear friend. We're both the same age, both together in the heyday of our youth. And he just mentions that kind of a Christian theory of friendship. Like, true friendship was a Greek idea, and the Romans agreed with it. But as a Christian, he points out that unless in you, God, you bind friends together, the love which is sown in their hearts, basically, friendship can't last unless it's godly friendship. That's the Christian view. But still, the ancient world really viewed friendship very passionately. And it mentions here it's a binding, right? It's not just like, we're friends, we party. It's like, no. Like, it was friendship was a lifetime connection and true love between friends. And not sensual love, but like intellectual and emotional love, for sure. Nowadays, it's been very much changed, which is weird. And his friend joined him on his trip to being a Manichaean. And then he mentions, yet the moment before we had reached the end of the first year of a friendship that was sweeter to me than all the joys of life I had lived until then, you took him from this world, for you are a God of vengeance as well as the fountain of mercy. And he says, you follow close behind the fugitive and recall us to yourself in ways we cannot understand. So his friend got super sick. And then he asked the question, right? And this is the humanist question that all religions have to answer. How can I understand what you did at that time, my God? How can I plumb the unfathomable depths of your judgment? Right? When somebody dies, like, you ask why, man. And this guy's a saint of the church, and he still has the same question. It's like, why'd my friend die? Like, it was he was the up until that point, the biggest love of his life, right? And his friend was, and it says here, my friend fell gravely ill with a fever. And then, interesting, they mention his family baptized him. That's a Christian baptism, by the way. And then he recovered quickly, didn't want to hear the Manichaean things anymore, seemed to have had a full conversion experience, and then died immediately, within 3 days. Very sad. And he mentions, my heart grew somber with grief. Wherever I looked, I saw only death. My own country became a torment, and my home a grotesque abode of misery. All that we had done together was now grim ordeal without him. My eyes searched everywhere for him, but he was not there to be seen. I hated all the places we had known together, because he had not come, and they were no longer whispered to me, quote, here he comes, unquote, as they would have done had we been alive, but absent for a while. And then he became a puzzle to himself. And again, the questions you ask me are sad, right? He said, why are you so downcast? Why do you distress me? And his soul had no answer to give. And he says, the well-loved man whom she had lost, his soul, was better and more real than the shadowy being whom I would have had her trust. Tears alone were sweet to me for my heart's desire. They had taken the place of my friend. So he made a friend, and then his friend died. Like, it's pretty horrible. Yeah, I'm empathetic. I had a good friend die when I was young too. It happens. So, and then he gets into kind of the theory of troubles again, right? It's St. Augustine doing his asides, troubles and being steadfast. And he kind of gives us reassurance on 5. He says, "By now, O Lord, all this is past time and has healed the wound." And he kind of addresses it. "Can it be, though you are present everywhere, you have thrust aside our troubles? You are steadfast, constant in yourself, but we are tossed on the tide that puts us to the proof," that means to the test. "And if we could not sob our troubles to your ear, what hope would we have left in us?" And he says, "How can it be that there's a sweetness in the fruit we pluck from the bitter crop of life, in the mourning and the tears wailing in the sights?" And he's asking a question. Does the sweetness spring from hope, the hope that you will hear them? And then he's a Christian, right? So he has to say, when we pray, this is truly so because the purpose of prayer is to reach your ear. So like the sweetness of suffering is like even non-religious people hope something hears them. It's not just themselves. And he mentions at the time, he simply grieved and wept. His heart was broken and he lost his joy. Or is it weeping too? And this is back to his theory of theater. Becoming a pleasure only when things we once enjoyed turn loathsome, and only as long as our dislike of them remains. So, he mentions here he felt like he lost. Where is this? I gotta switch pages. But yeah, he points out for a while there he did lose his joy in his life. Like, this is pretty crushing for him. But he makes some interesting observations here. Let's see, do I have it on the next one? Even though he was sad his friend died, he mentions, quote, "In this misery which I lived, yet my own wretched life was dearer to me than the friend I lost." He says, "Gladly though I would have changed it, I was more loth to lose my life than I had been to lose my friend." And then he mentions some classical stories of friendship, and he just wasn't very... He says, "Suppose the great love I had for my friend made me hate and fear death all the more, as though it were the most terrible of enemies, because it had snatched him away from me. I thought that, just because it had seized him, it would seize all others too without warning. I still remember how these thoughts filled my mind." And he asks the questions, right? Like, why would other men live when his friend is dead? Because he loved him more. Why did he die? Why am I alive? And he mentions that when the poet Horace says his friend, when he called his friend half his soul, for I felt that our two souls had been as one living two bodies, and life to me was fearful, and I did not want to live with only half a soul. So again, really sad experience here. And he gets into it on 7, a lot of it. What madness to love a man as something more than human. This is where he kind of points out some of the interesting problems he had. He talks about his burden. Where is this? I lived in a fever, convulsed with tears and sights that allowed me neither to rest or peace of mind. My soul was a burden, bruised and bleeding. And this again, he's very wordy, very well. You can see his oration in his words. He says this: I was tired of the man who carried it, but I found no place to set it down to rest, and nothing worked. Books of poetry, gardens, nothing. I had heart for only sighs and tears, for in them alone I found a shred of consolation. And again, he's a Christian, so what's the solution? What's the hope? He says, but if I tried to stem my tears, a heavy load of misery weighed me down. I knew, O Lord, that I ought to offer to you, for you would heal it. But this I would not do, nor could I, especially as I did not think of you as anything real or substantial. So Manichaeans didn't think God was real, basically. And it was not in you that I believed, but in some empty fragment. The God I worshipped, small g God, was my own delusion, and if I tried to find him in a place to rest my burden, there was nothing there to uphold it. So again, pretty miserable, and he started to figure out his philosophy doesn't work. Now, again, like anything, right? Time doesn't stand still. This is 8. He said, time never stands still, nor does it idly pass without effect on our feelings, or fail to work its wonders in our mind. It came and went, day after day, and it passed, and it filled me with fresh hope and new thoughts to remember. Humans are really good at dealing with suffering. And he started to get over it. But again, right, if you didn't read this yet, I'd read it just for... He is very descriptive of this. And he mentions, like, what's some of the problems with his friends. He said, I felt, this is the subsection 8, he says, I felt the loss of my friend had struck so easily into my innermost heart simply because I had poured my soul upon him, like water upon sand, loving a man who was mortal as though he were never to die. And other friends gave him solace, but he said, my love of a huge fable which I loved instead of you, my God, and the long drawn-out lie, which our minds are always itching to hear, only to be defiled by its adulterous caresses. And he said this didn't cure him of his quote-unquote fable, right? He still kept going the wrong way. But he makes a point, if you're a Platonic thinker or a Christian thinker, right, and there's an infinite or an undying or an unchangeable thing to love, is that better to love that than a thing that dies, right? The thing that dies is suffering. The Buddhists are right. We'll talk about that, though, next book. But yeah, time moved on. He recovered. And then he gets 9 is interesting. Let me see. Do I have one after this? I want to see. I have one more. Okay. He gets or 2 more. He gets into cherishing friendship. This is number 9. And again, it's cool to see kind of the classic theory on friendship shown here. This is what we cherish in friendship, and we cherish it so dearly that conscience will feel guilty if we do not return love for love, asking no more of our friends than those expressions of goodwill. This is why we mourn their death, which shrouds us in sorrow and turns joy into bitterness, so that the heart is drenched in tears and life becomes a living death, because our friend is lost. And then he mentions, again, bringing it all back to theology, he says, blessed are those who love you, O God, and love their friends and you, and their enemies for your sake. They alone will never lose those who are dear to them, for they love one who loves, whose is never lost, in God. Right, so if there's a love that didn't die, that would be a better love. And again, if you're not a Christian, you wouldn't believe it, or a Greek, but if logically speaking, that makes sense. And then why would he do this theoretically, right? The theory of this, obviously, is... Right, he brings it all back. So this is what he's famous for doing. He keeps his threads together, right? He says, for wherever the soul of man may turn, unless it turns to you, it clasps sorrow to itself. Even though it clings to things of beauty, if their beauty is outside of God and outside the soul, it only clings to sorrow. And then we get a little of his beauty theory here, which is interesting. This is subsection 10, page 80. He says, these things of beauty would not exist at all unless they came from you. Like the sun, they rise and set. He gets into kind of transient beauty here on 10. I'd read it. I thought it was really interesting. And you get the kind of a restatement, or a Christian restatement of the classic Greek argument for beauty. And he mentions here, they are sufficient for the purposes for which they were made, but they cannot halt the progress of transient things, which pass from their allotted beginnings to their allotted ends. So all things have planned beginnings and ends. All such things are created from your word, which tells him, here is your beginning and your end. Yeah. So again, this is where we get more pure philosophy again. 10 and 11. Actually, we're going to stop on 11 because I think we're out of time. And when you say word, it's the Greek idea of logos, which is like logic of the universe. When you hear word in a Christian context, it doesn't mean like a word I say, but for the Greeks, it means logic of the universe, basically. So for a Aristotelian, more Platonic understanding of philosophy, you get this one here, where we get the tie-in. And he kind of berates what he says, foolish souls. Let me read this. My soul, do not listen to my... Oh, you too must listen to the word of God. So he's kind of talking to himself in the past, basically. Do not be foolish. Do not let the din of your folly deafen your ears for your heart. For the word himself calls you to return. Capital W. In him is the place of peace that cannot be disturbed and will not be withhold himself from your love unless you withhold your love from him. And it never passes away. So the Word of God is a euphemism for Jesus, too. So it's like the logic of the universe and all the rules and all the... everything is held up by God, basically. That's his point. How does he make that point? Why does it connect anywhere from here? It connects to his theory of beauty, basically. And that connects to sorrow, and then that connects to the whole theme of the chapter. St. Augustine does this a lot, right? He manages to tie things back around. So take a look at 11 if you're curious about that. But that's where I plan to stop, unless you guys got questions, because I'm pretty happy with that. Oh yeah, so 11 is interesting too, because it does give you more of the nature of Augustine's conception of God. Let me see, is there anything else I want to read there? I'll just take a look at it. I'll let us go a little early today. I think I got as far as I wanted. We almost finished book 4, so this is a good place to stop a couple minutes early. So any questions before we call it for today? I'm pretty happy with that. We started a couple minutes early. That's about as far as I wanted to get. Any questions or comments or parts that you didn't find satisfying, let me know. You can always ask them in the Discord too, and I'll answer them later. All right. Well, I'm going to end the stream here. I will answer other questions in the Discord. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks for being here. We'll be back on Thursday.